Sorry about that slight technical error here. Welcome to this webinar. Let me introduce myself. I'm Richard Mythe, and thank you, Frank, for your kind words here. And what I'm going to do is just move straight into the presentation. And to do that, I need to share my screen with you. And I'm going to as I say, let's just try and go back. Science stories from New Zealand shopping basket. We seem to have lost at first light. Let me start off by, first of all, a few words about the Liggins Institute. It's a wonderful place to work. It's a great privilege to come to New Zealand and join the Liggins Institute, a world-leading centre for research into, as you say, fetal child health and nutrition. And as Frank said, I spent half my time as a chief scientist working for the high-value National Nutrition National Science Challenge, a 10-year programme financed by the Ministry of Business in New Zealand. And I think both the Liggins and the high-value nutrition, we both ask similar kind of questions. What foods do we need to eat and stay healthy? Can foods boost my immune system? That's quite topical at the moment. What about reducing my risk of diabetes? And also, how does the academic science in New Zealand support the New Zealand food and beverage industry, which is, of course, incredibly important to New Zealand's economy, and it will be particularly in the next few years as we emerge out of our present difficulties. But today, I'm going to tell you some stories. And I'm going to really say 3 stories. And these involve kind of what I view as kind of iconic New Zealand food products that I hope we all like and enjoy. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about mussels and shellfish. But that story is going to start a long time ago, about 100,000 years ago, right at the tip of Africa. And then I'm going to move forward a long time and tell you a little bit about kumara. And that story is going to start about 1,000 years ago and about how kumara came to New Zealand and some of the science we're doing on that now. And then my last story is going to be about kiwi fruit. And that's a story of 19th century plant collectors, and that's from about 100 years ago. So these 3 foods have very different stories, but they all come together in New Zealand. So let me start at the beginning. And by the beginning, I really do mean the very beginning, because we're going to go back to look at these caves in the tip of Africa. And these caves, they've been excavated over the past 20, 30 years, and they've been quite remarkable. Now, the people who lived in these caves were completely modern humans, just like us. And if you could somehow acquire a newborn, the thought experiment, from these caves and you brought them to Auckland and they grew up in Auckland, I would be sure that that child would grow up like any other New Zealand kid. They'd want to go skateboarding and surfing. And before long, they'd be telling us how to use our mobile phones. So these were completely modern humans. And the interest in these caves is really 2 things, both of which I find absolutely remarkable. The first is aspects of their culture. And these are some of the artifacts found in those caves. And you can see there's shells, which are probably made into jewelry, all sorts of tools and spearheads and such like, but also the very earliest examples of art. And these are abstract art. And you can see here engravings on this stone, and on this stone there are some paintings. And these are the very earliest examples of art we have. They predate the cave paintings in southern France, the art in Australia, the ancient rock art in Australia, by about at least 30,000 years. The other remarkable thing we have about these caves and these people is that we know what they had for dinner. And being as a kind of food scientist, I find this particularly interesting. And there are 2 types of information here. here we can see some sediments going down through here. And these two white layers here are ash layers. Now, these ash layers, they haven't come from volcanoes or anything. They've come from domestic fires. They're kind of hearth fires. And if you look in those ash layers with a microscope, you can find the signs of plant tissue. And this is a photograph here using a scanning electron micrograph. And this plant tissue has a very characteristic structure, and it's of a starchy root, a starchy rhizome. And these people were eating carbohydrates. These were almost like their chips. They weren't deep fried chips, they were more like oven chips. They cooked them within the fire. So they're eating carbohydrates. And we know that humans have this long, long history of eating carbohydrates. But we also know what they were eating with their carbohydrates, because they left behind these big waste heaps, which we call middens, these shell middens. And you can date these very accurately using radiocarbon dating. And you can find that they contain all sorts of the remnants of the shellfish they were eating. Here's some actual data from one of these publications. And you can see a whole range of different shellfish. These are all different shellfish here. The 3 bars are from 3 different time periods. And you can see in the latter 2 time periods, the one they ate most of all was Perna persa, and that's the brown mussel, this one here. And this was very important in their diet. So these people are basically eating carbohydrates and mussels. And indeed, that's almost exactly what I had for my dinner the other night. So we have a very nice kind of continuation of what we eat. Maybe 2 differences. Their cooking might have been better than mine. And of course, my dinner guest had to join me online, because I don't think these people 100,000 years ago had to endure the kind of lockdown that we've had. They could have had their dinner guests in person. Now, what then happened to these modern humans? Well, about 60, 70,000 years ago, of course, they left Africa and they moved out of Africa. They crossed into Asia about here. And one of the main migration routes was what we call this southern migration route, which was down through Asia, around the tip of India, and then down across into Australia. And they reached Australia about 50,000 years ago. And of course, at this time, sea level was a bit lower. So there were many land bridges across into Asia and then across down into Australia. And then a little bit later on, they moved up across the Bering Straits into the Americas, and then down through the North America and South America, and again, largely through a coastal route, right down to the very tip. And they reached the tip of South America about 8 or 10,000 years ago. And then about 10,000 years ago, the glaciers started melting, sea level started rising, and these human explorers, they began exploring the northern latitudes of Europe. And then 3,000 years ago, the last great human migration was, of course, across the Pacific, and then 1,000 years down to New Zealand. Now, how do we know all this, and what did they leave behind? Well, everywhere they went, they left these big shell middens. And these are remnants of their food that they're eating. They are a fantastic source for archaeologists, and here we find ones in the Middle East, in Australia, then up in North America. And then here, of course, they followed the rivers into the middle of North America, and here are some freshwater shell middens, and then down into South America. And then again into Northern Europe and New Zealand. And there's some really excellent shell middens all around New Zealand coast, dating from anywhere from a few hundred to about 900 years ago. And these middens give a really indication that shellfish were a very important part of the diet. Now, of course, we don't have any written records of this, but we do have one account, which is actually from Charles Darwin in his Voyage of the Beagle. And in the 1830s, he stopped for some time on Terra del Fuego, and this is the island right at the bottom of South America. And at that time, the people living there were very much living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And if I can just read this, the inhabitants living chiefly upon shellfish are obliged constantly to change their place of residence, but they return at intervals to the same spots as evident from the piles of old shells, which must often amount to many tons in freight. These heaps can be distinguished at long distance by their bright green colours of certain plants which invariably grow on them. And amongst these are enumerated the wild celery and scurvy grass, two very serviceable plants, the use of which have not been discovered. So Darwin is saying how important shellfish were in the diet of these people. Now, of course, when Maori arrived in New Zealand, and the Maoris tell stories of when they came, they trailed ropes behind their waka, and they brought mussels, but there was an abundance of mussels when they arrived in New Zealand. And New Zealand, we have three types of mussels which are certainly edible. The blue mussel, which is a species found all around the world, cultivated all around the world. And then our really important green-shelled mussel. This is a native, it's an endemic species, it only grows in New Zealand. And then freshwater mussels. Now, freshwater mussels have now become very rare in New Zealand, but as in other parts of the world. But there are freshwater middens of freshwater mussels, particularly around the Rotorua Lake area, indicating that they're an important part of the diet of the early Maori settlers here. And what's happened in New Zealand really is since about the early 1970s, we've developed a fantastic industry in New Zealand, which employs many people, generates lots of revenue for New Zealand. And I think last year produced about 100,000 tons of mussels, and these were exported to over 70 countries. Now, it's been interesting to think about mussel cultivation, because certainly up to really about now, a lot of the wild seed or the seed, it's the larvae mussels that are gathered from beaches, and 90 Mile Beach is one of the most important ones. And these baby mussels are gathered from here and then inoculated onto these ropes. It's a little bit like gathering wild barley seed from wild plants and sowing them in your garden. But it's been amazing in New Zealand to really discover, and the really excellent world-leading research in New Zealand led particularly by the Cawthron Institute in Nelson. And they've been world leaders in developing methods to actually now generate the mussel seed in tanks. And these can then be inoculated onto the ropes, and they have had a very good public partnership, which has led to SPAT New Zealand, and that is a company that produces these mussels on these ropes for commercial companies. And one aspect that has led to is the opportunity to start developing and breeding mussels for particular purposes, and it may be better diseases. I think we're going to have to deal with the rise in sea temperatures over the next 10 or 20 years. But also it opens up opportunities to breed mussels for better nutritional purposes. And I'll come back to this just shortly. But if I can just have a little bit of a divergence into oysters, because those shell middens, of course, contains many other species of shellfish people eat, including oysters. Now, oysters, there's 3 edible species in New Zealand. 2 of them, the bluff oysters and the rock oysters, are native, they're indigenous, and they've been eaten for a long time, right back to the first settlers in New Zealand. The Pacific oyster arrived much more later, in the 1950s, it came by itself. And of course, we're familiar with oysters being this very kind of luxurious high-end food. You know, you pay $4 or $5 for an oyster. But that's relatively recent. For much of our history, and certainly for much of the 17th and 18th century, oysters were really the poor man's food. And here on the right, you can see some photographs. This is actually from New York, and New York was an amazing center of oysters, using the big oyster beds. And they provided employment for lots of people, but also cheap food for people. And here you can see a little drawing of, I think this is meant to be London, And here you can see the beef and oyster pie. Now what's the point of a beef and oyster pie? Well, oyster was the cheap protein source you put in to bulk it up, to beef up the beef as such. So oysters had this association with people on low incomes and such. And there's a little bit of writing I'll share with this. This is from Charles Dickens, the Pickwick Papers. Pickwick Papers was the first of Charles Dickens' publications. It was a weekly series, a bit like a kind of soap opera. And it didn't do very well until he introduced this character called Sam Weller. Here's Sam Weller, who's a bit like a kind of cheerful Cockney kind of guy. And here's Sam Weller showing the Mr. Pickwick around the streets of London. And I'll just read you the last paragraph. "What I mean, sir," said Sam, "is that the poorer a place is, the greater call there seems to be for oysters. Look here, sir, here's an oyster stall to every half dozen houses. The streets are lined with them. Blessed if I don't think that when a man's very poor, he rushes out of his lodgings and eats oysters in regular desperation." Now, of course, you've got to be slightly careful with Dickens because he does kind of exaggerate life a little bit larger than life characters. But the general notion of this is true, and that oysters had this association with kind of the poor man's food. You see a little bit of the end of that time in New Zealand. And in the latter part of the 19th century, you've got the oyster saloons. And here's a couple of photographs. Here's one in Auckland on the right here. I think this one is in Invercargill. And again, oysters were being harvested, particularly from the beds in the Marlborough Sounds. And here's a little advert, which I quite like. This is from a shop in Nelson. 30 bushels of splendid oysters, as fresh as daisies, it says. So what happened to this? And of course, what happened both in New Zealand and in Europe and North America, these oysters were just being harvested in a non-sustainable way. And eventually the beds were totally decimated. Oysters raised in prices, and they no longer became the food for the masses, but became this very luxury food. And what happened to the oyster saloons? Well, I think they very largely evolved into our fish and chip shops. Now, if we just go back then to a little bit of science, a little bit about what is so good for mussels, and the same would apply to oysters and other shellfish, that nutritionally, these are really excellent foods to have in your diet. And here's a picture of a mussel opened up, and you can see they are an excellent source of protein. They do contain some fat. It's a low level of saturated fat, but they're very high in these healthy fats. Some of them are omega-3 fatty acids, long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. I'm sure you've heard of these. These are what algae make, and they come into mussels, but they also have some other really interesting, what we call bioactive lipids. They're a great source of minerals, such as iron, iodine, and selenium, and magnesium. And the important thing about these is that they are what we call bioavailable. Now, we all have lots of advice to have a more wholemeal diet, plants, and they have lots of minerals as well, but they're often very difficult to absorb. But these shellfish are a very good source of minerals to absorb in our diet. And finally, they're a very good source of so-called B vitamins, things like folate and vitamin B12. So they're a really good nutrition package. And I'd just like to comment about some really excellent research going on in New Zealand, financed by the High Value Nutrition Challenge, led by Matt Miller at the Cawthron and Marlena Kruger at Massey. Now, there has been interest in looking at cognitive development, but our interest in New Zealand is mainly on joint motility and arthritis. And as soon as this lockdown, or we move away from level 3, there'll be 2 trials which will be starting, led by Matt and Marlena, and also Plant and Food in Palmerston North. And one of these is looking at inflammation and how if people are eating a diet with green shell mussels, and they have a diet which will contain this, how that helps their muscles recover from intense use and also some damage. And then the other study we're going to start is with women, postmenopausal women, looking at how if they're on a diet containing green shell mussels, they can help to prevent the degradation of cartilage. So they're really great studies that we're going to be starting soon. Now, the last thing to say about mussels are not only good for our health, but good for the planet as well. This is some data looking at their carbon footprints. Now, this is not data from New Zealand. I think New Zealand data is similar. It may be a little bit different in the absolute amounts, but you can see here, this is the amount of carbon dioxide produced per kilogram of food products. And you can see how very low mussels are compared to things like farmed fish or chicken or beef and sheep. And so in the future, I think the New Zealand agriculture industry in general, but mussels in particular, probably have a great role to play in moving towards this zero carbon economy, which we hope to achieve by 2050. So let me move on. Now, we saw those people spreading all around the world, and then about 10,000 years ago, really something interesting happened at about the same time in different places, in that we had the emergence of agriculture. So the people there, they looked at the natural plants growing there and the animals, and they started domesticating them. So you can see in different parts of the world, different crops were domesticated. Wheat and barley in the so-called Fertile Crescent in the Middle East. Things like maize, beans, squashes in Central America. Some of the small grain cereals, millets and sorghums in Africa. And then in South America, you have things like potatoes, tomatoes, sweet potatoes and beans. Now, many of these crops have all come to New Zealand, and each one of them has their own story. And in New Zealand, we are fortunate that we can build on all that long history of those crops and the work of those native peoples in the different countries, and we grow them, and they're very important. I'm just going to tell one story of how one of those came, which is a sweet potato or kumara. Now, before I get on to that, I just want to comment about potato, because it is quite interesting that both the sweet potato, or what we know as kumara, the Spanish would know as camote, and the other potato, or the Irish potato, the white potato, they were both domesticated in the same part of South America, in kind of Peru, at about the same time, about 10,000 years ago. And in fact, in Peru, in Lima, there's this international research center called SIP, and you can see in the little symbol there, there's the little person there, and in his right hand, he's holding Solanum potatoes, and his left hand, he's holding Ipomaea potatoes. Now, just a couple of words about here. Ipomaea batatus is the scientific name. Ipomaea comes from the Greek, and it means something like a worm, and it refers to these climbing and twining tendrils that sweet potato has. But in the pre-Columbian era, so before Europeans came, sweet potato already spread up into Central America and the Caribbean. And when the Spanish and Portuguese really came to the Caribbean, the first people they met were the Taino people. Unfortunately, these people really no longer exist anymore. And their name for sweet potato was batata. And you can see this comes into a scientific name. And then when the Spanish came down to Peru, they found potatoes grown, and the Quechua word, this is the ancient Peruvian language, which is still widely spoken today, is papa. And the Spanish combined both names to produce patata, which is where we get potato from. So by that, potato has come to refer to both crops, which is sometimes a little bit confusing. But we know that these plants are really completely unrelated, and there you can see the flowers of potato flowers. And you're probably familiar with these, are like tomato or tobacco flowers. You'll rarely see flowers of kumara in New Zealand because it doesn't really flower here. But the flowers are like this. They're very beautiful flowers. And these are 3 wild Ipomaea species. These 2 you'll see in New Zealand. Ipomaea indica is the morning glory. And this, of course, was introduced as a garden plant into New Zealand. And it's naturalized and it's gone weedy. And this was actually photographs taken up in the Auckland domain. Ipomaea corica is one of our 2 more native Ipomaea species. It's we're at the very edge of its distribution, and this is taken one of the Gulf Islands. It's mainly a tropical one. Now, you won't see this one in New Zealand. This is a South American one, but it's very important for our Kumara story. So if we now do a little bit of plant genetics. So plants have a cell, and there you can see the nucleus. The nucleus contains most of the DNA. And these three plants are what we call diploid, and they're like you and me. We have pairs of chromosomes. Now, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. These species have 15 pairs of chromosomes. Now, plants also have these structures called chloroplasts, and really these should be green colored because that's where the chlorophyll is, and that's where they make all the carbohydrates from the sun and the carbon dioxide. And chloroplasts also contain a little bit of DNA themselves. Now, about 800,000 years ago, so a very long time ago, an ancestor of this species diverged, it split into two. And this is a very odd thing happened in that this genome, it triplicated. So instead of having 15 pairs of chromosomes, it's got 45 pairs of chromosomes. And they're all complicated, packed in that nucleus. And this is a very common thing to happen to crop plants. So while we may call this diploid, dip being two, we call this hexaploid from the Greek hex meaning six. So this is hexaploid. And in fact, the Solanum potato would be tetraploid. They would have 4 sets of chromosomes. So this divided, and this hexaploid is actually, this became the Ipomaea. And you can see the flowers are rather similar. But then something even more complicated happened, and I must say we don't quite understand this, in that about 56,000 years ago, this split into two distinct types. And this one, it somehow captured the chloroplasts from this diploid one. So we now have two distinct types of sweet potato. We can say we have one line, we can call this as a red chloroplast, and this is our kumara, and the blue line, which is what we refer to as kamote or batata. And these evolved in the northern part of Peru and the kumara in the southern part of Peru. Now, just looking at those names, batata, we heard came from the Taino people here. Kamote, which is what a lot of the Spanish people call sweet potato, that actually came from an ancient language of the Aztec people in Mexico, which is now not spoken very much or at all. Now, the name of kumara, this is going to be controversial. It's very much a hot potato, if you don't mind the pun. And quite a lot of people will maintain the word kumara came from the ancient Peruvian language quechua, as we saw where papa comes from as well. Now, and we'll come back to that shortly. Now, what we have, what happens is that in prehistoric times, so before any written records, we know that kumara spread across the Pacific. And there are archaeological excavations in Hawaii and other islands which have shown that people were growing kumara about 1,000 years ago. And at some point, probably about 800–900 years ago with Maori, it spread down to New Zealand. The Portuguese took a sweet potato largely from the Caribbean in the beginning of the 16th century, and that spread through, actually right through Africa and Europe and right back into Southeast Asia. And there's a lot of diversity, new sources of diversity back here. And then the Spanish took what they call camote from more Central America across to China and Japan in the mid part of the 16th century. So the question which has been very asked many times is, how did kumara spread across the Pacific at least 1,000 years ago? And there are two main hypotheses here, two main ideas. One is that those Polynesian navigators on that last great human migration, is that they came across about 3,000 years ago, and then they actually went all the way across to South America about 1,000 years ago. and they came back. And when they came back, they brought Kumara with them. And they left behind chickens in South America, and also some technology of like boat building and fish hooks and such like. Now, this is very controversial, and there's a great debate going on in literature about the archaeological dates of where these chickens arrived and such like. And of course, the other reason given to support this hypothesis is the word Kumara, and that these ancient Polynesians not only brought the Kumara back with them, but they brought the word back with them from Peru, and then that diversified in the different Polynesians to the different words that all referred to Kumara now, and we have Kumara in New Zealand. So that's evidence that there may have been some prehistoric contact between Polynesian navigators and South America. The other hypothesis is that actually they never got to South America, and that Kumara was actually spread across the Pacific by ocean currents, maybe bits of plant material, or maybe birds took the seeds or such like, to maybe some of the central islands of the Pacific, and then it was spread by the Polynesians to different islands. Now, that would be interesting because it would suggest there was independent domestication both in Polynesia and South America of sweet potato. But what about the language? So one explanation for that is indeed Kumara, the name Kumara didn't come from South America, but actually it was taken there. And in the 17th century, a lot of Spanish priests in particular started writing that ancient language down. And one idea is that maybe they took the word Kumara, which they were familiar with, and introduced it back into South America. And as I say, this is quite a controversial area. But there is some recent evidence from plant genetics, and this is a really interesting story. Now, Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander were, of course, the plant collectors with Captain Cook on all his journeys. And they collected this particular herbarium specimen from the Society Islands, which is right in the middle of the Pacific, in 1769. And a couple of years ago, this research group here, they extracted DNA from this plant material. They actually extracted the DNA from the chloroplasts, and they compared it with material collected from South America. And they suggested that this plant had actually diverged from the South American ones 100,000 years ago. And that would give some support to the idea that this was naturally distributed across the Pacific and wasn't reliant on those Polynesian navigators. Now, that would also mean that we would expect, if we looked at the sweet potatoes and the Kumara across the Pacific Islands and in New Zealand, we'd expect to find all that red kind, the Kumara kind. And this study was done a few years ago by a research group. It was actually a group based in France. But they found that actually it was the blue type, the camote type, which really dominated most of the sweet potato and Kumara, both in New Zealand and on the Pacific Islands. But what they did something, again, very interesting. They went back to those herbarium specimens, and there's actually quite a lot collected in the 18th, 19th century from across the Pacific and New Zealand. And again, they looked at the DNA, and they showed that if you look at the herbarium material, it is all the red kind. And that's really helped us with our story of how Kumara was introduced into New Zealand and the history of Kumara in New Zealand. So we think it was introduced by Maori about 1,000 years ago, and they did an absolutely wonderful job with it because it's basically a tropical crop, and they had to develop new types of agricultural system, new types of storage to adapt it to basically a semi and a non-tropical environment. And here you can see this is an archaeological excavation on the Coromandel Peninsula, and this is one of the storage pits they think that they used to store Kumara in. This is a little map. You won't see the details of it, but I'll just point out, here's the storage pits. This is this pit here. And here are the big shell middens. So again, they were probably eating Kumara and mussels for their dinner. What we think now happened is that in the mid-19th century, in the kind of peak of that early phase of whaling, there was an introduction of a lot more clones of kumara and sweet potato into New Zealand by Americans. And these would have been some of the kamote type, the kind of blue type, and that diluted the traditional kumara. And then again in the 20th century, further types were introduced. And so now in New Zealand, we have a mixture of sweet potato and kumara, and we're not sure when any of those very original Mara introductions still exist here. Now, if I just move on to some aspects of why we're interested in this nutrition, and before I get on to what we're doing in New Zealand, I just really want to mention the really amazing story of sweet potato has had in terms of nutrition. And this is the introduction of the orange flesh sweet potato into parts of Africa and Asia to really alleviate chronic vitamin A deficiency. Now, the orange color, and some of the kumara we buy in our supermarkets will be orange, that's beta carotene. And when we eat this, the beta carotene molecule splits into two, and these are two molecules of vitamin A. And we need vitamin A for our cognitive development as children, and particularly again for our eyesight. And over the past 20 years, there's been a really great program to introduce orange flesh potato into these areas of the world of vitamin A deficiency. And it's been a great public health story and a great kind of story of how agriculture and plant genetics can help human health. And the people who really did that, these are the main people who did that. They were given the World Food Prize in 2016, along with the International Potato Centre. And just mention, the International Potato Centre is a great place to visit. It has a huge collection of sweet potatoes. Some of them are kept in tissue culture here, and you can keep these for a few years. But every year they grow out thousands of clones of these sweet potatoes. They have a collection of maybe 10,000 different types, but there's remarkably few from the Pacific and New Zealand in their collection. Now, our interest in New Zealand is actually in their carbohydrates. And I'll do a very quick catch up on carbohydrates. And here we have carbohydrates are chains of sugar molecules, and these are glucose molecules and they're long chains. And these can either be in straight chains like this, and you can see here, so each one of these little beads is like a glucose molecule, a sugar molecule, or they can be rather branched. Now, animals and humans, we tend to store energy as fat, not as carbohydrate, but we do store a little bit as carbohydrate in the form of glycogen, and this will be in our muscles and our liver, and you can see this is a very branched molecule. Now, when we eat carbohydrates, in order to absorb it, we need to break it down into these individual glucose molecules. And we do this with an enzyme called amylase. We have amylase in our saliva and in our pancreas. And what this does is chip away at those glucose molecules, and it chips them off in turn. And that means if the chain is straight, it's only got two ends. That's quite a slow process. But if it's got lots of ends like this, it's much faster. And if it's got glycogen, it's very fast indeed. And glycogen is a rapid energy store for us. So when we eat a carbohydrate which is very branched, we digest it very quickly. And these amylases are in our saliva, in our pancreas. There's our pancreas, and that puts enzymes into this bit of our gut. And very quickly after eating these, we see our blood glucose will rise, and we get this peak of glucose. That stimulates our insulin to start working, and that will bring our glucose down to normal. And of course, if you suffer from diabetes, this may take a longer time to go down. If we eat these largely unbranched carbohydrates, they're very slow to digest here, and a lot of them will go into our large colon, and this is full of bacteria, our microbiome. And the carbohydrates tend to feed the bacteria more than they feed us, and they will convert the carbohydrates to short-chain fatty acids. Now, the ligands has a lot of expertise in type 2 diabetes and regulation of glucose metabolism, and also the microbiome. But there's also a lot of interest in New Zealand about how this may stimulate the development of the immune system in infants. And this is work particularly by Professor Claire Wall and her colleagues. Now, if I just take you through this, this is looking at a newborn baby, back with a newborn. And when they're born, they tend to have a rather simple microbiome. It's often a little bit peculiar. They pick up bugs from their mother when they're born, and also from the environment or their pet dog or such like. There are particular carbohydrates, short chain ones, very short ones, in breast milk, and they feed particular bacteria in the baby's gut, and these are beneficial. But Claire and her colleagues are interested in the next stage at about 6 months, once babies start getting solid food. And we're interested in how the carbohydrates in kumara can stimulate particular bugs in the microbiome, and that will boost the immune system. And Claire has completed a really excellent study last year called Nourish to Flourish. This was with infants about 6 months, and it used a kumara, a dry kumara. And again, as soon as we move away from level 3, Claire and her colleagues have a really much bigger study called the Sun Study. And if any of you have children, you might like to volunteer for that study. Now, finally, in the last few minutes, I will just tell you the final story about kiwi fruit. Kiwi fruit grows wild in parts of China. It has a long history of consumption in China, but not really cultivated. And this is a story of plant collectors. And here we see a selection of collectors. Now, you're familiar with Joseph Banks. We came across him a little bit earlier. The year Joseph Banks stepped into New Zealand, Alexander von Humboldt, probably one of the greatest explorers, was born. And Alexander von Humboldt met Joseph Banks when he was a young man, and they had a lifelong collaboration. Von Humboldt was a great inspiration to Charles Darwin, another great explorer and collector. I mentioned Marianne North. I'll come back to her later on. And Charles Darwin, Marianne, she traveled the world and painted the most wonderful pictures. And Charles Darwin, in 1880, wrote to Marianne and suggested she went to New Zealand and Australia, which she did do. And Charles Darwin also inspired other collectors such as Henry Bates and Alfred Wallace. Now, what did these collectors do? They collected dry plants materials. They sent them to places like Kew. And at Kew, you had botanists like Joseph Hooker, William Hemsley, and they would take these specimens, they would describe them and publish floras. And here we have the first Flora of New Zealand published in 1855. Now, our story is with another plant collector, a Scottish one called Robert Fortune, and in 1840 he sent this particular plant specimen, this dry plant specimen, back to Kew. And at Kew there's a young botanist called Jules Planchon, a Frenchman in his early 20s, and he described this and he called it Actinidia chinensis, and this is the first kiwi fruit, the first scientific description of kiwi fruit. Just a couple of asides, Robert Fortune was a very interesting guy, but probably best known for his so-called espionage, and he is reputed to have smuggled the secrets of tea cultivation out of China in the 1840s and took them to India, into the British East Indian Company, and that led to the establishment of the Darjeeling tea plantations, then subsequently in Ceylon in East Africa. And there's a very good book to read about all that. Jules Planchon is also an interesting guy. I won't tell you about him particularly, but just to point out, some of you may recognize his name, the botanists amongst you. You may be familiar with this tree in New Zealand called tarapo. Grows in the northern part of New Zealand on the Gulf Islands. It has these fruits on which become very red. The Karoo love eating these fruits. And the scientific name is Planchonella costata, and that plant is named in the honor of Jules Planchon. But our story of kiwi fruit involves two other plant collectors, Augustine Henry and Ernest Wilson, in the latter second half of the 19th century. Here is one of their plant collecting expeditions. And they were based in China around Aichang. And Aichang was also where there was a Church of Scotland mission. And at that mission, there are a number of remarkable women missionaries, and 3 of those at least came from Dunedin in New Zealand. There was Mary Moore, Kate Fraser, Catherine Fraser, and Miss E. Smith. I'm afraid I don't know her name. Now, Mary Moore is a remarkable figure. She went to China in early 20s and was in China for over 50 years. And Catherine Fraser, although is the main player in our story. And here they all are actually on, looks like a picnic. This is up from the mission, and there you have the plant collector, E.H. Wilson. Because the story goes, and I think it's fairly true, the story, is that Ernest Wilson would visit that mission station, presumably to have some nice kind of social times with the missionaries there on those picnics. And at one point he passed kiwi fruit seed or plants to Kate Fraser. Now, Kate in 1904 was visited by her sister Isabel Fraser. And this was Isabel was her sister, and she was a remarkable woman. She graduated with a degree in physics from the University of Otago, and then became the principal of Waganui Girls' College. Now, she was a great teacher, but got bogged down with kind of management, administration, and submitted a letter of resignation, which her board refused to accept. But she was granted a 2-year leave of absence, and she visited her sister in Japan and then China. And when she came back to New Zealand, she brought the kiwi fruit seed back with her, or the plants. She passed those on to a pair of brothers, Alexander Allison, who was the gardener at Waganui Girls' College. His brother was a solicitor, but also a keen gardener. And they were the first people to grow kiwi fruit in New Zealand. That kiwi fruit was then passed on to Hayward Wright, who developed the first cultivars, and finally to Jim McLaughlin in the 1930s to produce the first kiwi fruit orchards. Now, then just briefly, why are we interested in kiwi fruit in the nutrition world? Because it's really, really good for you. One, it has very high levels of vitamin C. It's one of the richest sources of vitamin C in our diet. And vitamin C is, it was first characterized over 100 years ago, but we're still learning more and more about it. Vitamin C, of course, has great associations in New Zealand as well, because on Captain Cook, on his second trip, he was awarded the Copley Medal. Now, the Copley Medal is the oldest scientific award in the world, and he was awarded to it. Here's the commendation. It says, account for the method he had taken to preserve the health of the crew during his late voyage, whose communication with society was of such importance to the public. So it was really an award for the kind of public health. It's a bit like the story of vitamin A. And of course, he didn't, when they arrived, they didn't have kiwi fruit in New Zealand, but they harvested the scurvy grass. Now, scurvy grass, we heard about it earlier, it's not a grass. It tends to be little crucifers, members of the Brassica family. And we now commemorate that in New Zealand. We have this plant called Cook's scurvy grass, but unlike the Fijians, this was very well known to Maori. Now, it seems to have been rather rare in Cook's time. It's now become a very rare plant, but you can still see it if you go to Auckland Botanic Gardens. They've got some very nice specimens there. Now, and then just to finish, one of the main interests in New Zealand is how kiwi fruit is good for our gut health. How does it do this? It has a lot of fiber, and it has very interesting fiber that absorbs water, and it has particular enzymes in called proteases. Now, we heard a little bit about amylases, which cuts up carbohydrates. Proteases cut up proteins, and here they are, and it cuts them not from the ends, but from the middles, and this helps our digestion. Now, these proteases you also find in other fruits, such as pineapple, fig, pawpaw, and this is why you can use these fruits to tenderize meats. So these fruits have proteases in, but of all of these fruits, kiwi fruit is by far the highest. So, and then just briefly, we have some really excellent science going on across New Zealand in this whole area of kiwi fruit and gut health, and led by people such as Professor Richard Greary and Professor Nicole Roy of the University of Otago, and John Moreau of Plant and Food Research. and there's been a number of clinical trials and some more which will shortly start. So I need to finish now, and I've left my trolley behind. I've got my biodegradable New Zealand basket made out of New Zealand flax, and there it's all tipped out. And you can see there's my shellfish, giving me my protein, my healthy fats, my V vitamins, my minerals. My kumara, producing my carbohydrates, maybe my beta carotene. I actually prefer the flavour of the white fleshed sweet potato or kumara, and also my kiwi fruit. And all together, they make a healthy, delicious meal. So these foods have these very different, contrasting backstories, but all come together to give us a really healthy diet in New Zealand. With that, I'll finish, but with a few thanks, and particular thanks to Frank and Kate and Sarah, who really helped put this together and gave me some tips. I'd like to thank Claire, who acts both as my history consultant and also my dinner guest. My colleagues from HVN Nutrition, they're a great team, great colleagues, thank you very much. And also names of just a few of the people at the Liggins Institute, Chris, Farhar, Ramya, Jean, Joe and Justin, who have been great colleagues and made me very welcome in the Liggins. So on that, I will leave it, and thank you for that.